Now, around the same time, in the late 80s, if I'm correct, it was actually before, it was at the end of, near the end of Reagan's term. The Washington Times had a story, a famous story about basically a homosexual escort ring that was being led into the White House after hours. Is there any indication that this, because obviously homosexuality and pedophilia are two different issues, but is there any connection between this story that broke and the pedophile rings that were known to operate?
The Washington Times articles were boring into this story. They were boring into Craig Spence. Craig Spence had the house in Washington, D.C. that was wired for audiovisual blackmail, where a lot of the pedophilic orgies occurred. And he would take male prostitutes and, according to some people, underage prostitutes into the White House for midnight tours. And the person who had to take the fall for that, Craig Spence died under mysterious conditions like a lot of people in the Franklin scandal, but the person who ultimately took the fall for it ran an escort service, a gay escort service. His name was Henry Vincent. And he and I wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, in which he gets into dealing with Craig Spence and Larry King and how difficult it was and how malevolent they were. And they pressured him to acquire children for them, and he refused to do that. And he also gets into how he came across Craig Spence's blackmail equipment firsthand. And then the Washington Times reported also that Craig Spence's house was fitted with a lot of blackmail equipment. So Craig Spence was definitely blackmailing upper echelon people in the Reagan and Bush administrations, and also senators and congressmen in his home.
So now what levels, I mean, you mentioned previously that essentially these kids were brought to Washington, D.C. for certain pedophile parties. What level could you discern this actually went to as far as political power? I mean, Lawrence King is not someone who's known to most people, but are we talking about politicians that are known to the public?
Absolutely. In my investigation, Senator Schmidt, who headed the Franklin Committee, as I said earlier, was told that a caller told him not to pursue this investigation because it would go to the upper echelons of the Republican Party. And in my investigation, I've seen that it does go to the upper echelons of the Republican Party, and there's also a number of high-ranking Democrats, too. But if one steps back and they look at the power that was deployed to cover this up, okay, you had the Department of Justice in Nebraska, you had a hijacked grand jury in Nebraska, a hijacked state grand jury, and then you had a hijacked federal grand jury. And then in Washington, D.C., you had the Department of Justice and the Secret Service and also another hijacked grand jury. So you've got strings being pulled from the pinnacle of power to orchestrate this cover-up. And the fact that there's so many people involved in this cover-up really shows just how transcontinental this pedophile network was.